All right, I believe we are live. Just checking a couple of metrics super fast. Believe we are live. Let me mute that. All right, we're good, guys. All right, well, guys, thanks for tuning in. Anyone who might be out there, just another conversation about miracles. I'm with Caleb Jackson and Kenneth Vaughn. My name's Gabriel Lyon. We're just going to be having some conversation about possibly some particular miracle cases and maybe even about prayer studies more generally speaking. So just like last time, I'm going to open up the floor. If you guys want to have a little introduction, anything cool that you have going on in your life, feel free to start. You want to go ahead and start, Caleb?
Yeah, so my name's Caleb Jackson. I'm an author. I've published a book on the resurrection, a book on theodicy, and the book I'm currently working on is this topic on about modern miracle claims. It's probably going to be more of a tome by the time it's done. I'm about 430 pages in, and it's pretty small font, so estimating it's probably going to be well over 500 by the time it's finished. But so a pretty large scholarly work on that. And I've been fascinated by this ever since I wrote the first book, and I think that modern miracles are, in my opinion, one of the most interesting arguments for theism, because I think besides the typical philosophical arguments, I think empiricism and like hard data is more concrete for me and more interesting. And so that's kind of what got me into this. But yeah, I'm excited to be here today and to talk about this. I also have, for the viewers, if you go to Think Christian Theism blog, I have several posts up there. Some of them are about miracles as well. I'm one of the contributing authors of that blog. So go check that out.
Cool. Nice to finally be here with you, Caleb. I know assistant professor in residence of sociology at the University of Connecticut. I mostly work in areas of the sociology of religion and political sociology, areas that probably don't speak as much to these sorts of conversations about the truth of Christianity, theism in general, that sort of a thing. I mainly look at issues related to democracy, authoritarianism, anti-immigrant sentiment, and the typical justice issues that sociologists are concerned with. But I am personally a Christian. And when I became aware that there were people doing research that is somewhat methodologically similar to what I do in the area of prayer, I became personally interested in it. And so it's an area that I don't claim particular expertise in, but I am fascinated by it. I enjoy evaluating it. I enjoy talking about it. And it's one of my kind of favorite areas for reading that I don't necessarily get to write in. And so it's really awesome then to have an opportunity to talk about it. So thanks for having me here, Gabriel.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on. Yeah, it'll be cool I like seeing different faces. More perspectives is better, in my opinion. So, all right. So I don't think we actually even fully had decided which direction we wanted to go in. So were we cool with kind of going in the direction of some of the interests Kenneth had about prayer studies, and we can go from there? Does that sound cool with everybody?
Yeah, I think we should start there and then go to individual cases, but it makes sense to start more broad. So that's probably a good way to go.
All right. So I don't want to put too much pressure, but was there any sort of opening remarks then, Ken, if you wanted, or interest that you had in the subject that kind of like, oh, this was fascinating?
Yeah. I think the format that we're kind of falling upon works really well to start big and also start early. So for those that are watching, right, if you have kind of a lay interest in this, you may have heard of a study, and I'm going to kind of start with a kind of a pedantic point, and just to show you the annoying point of part of my academic brain. But you'll often hear it referred to as, quote, the Templeton study on prayer. And I personally don't like that framing. I do think what's going on there sometimes is they're trying to make it seem like Templeton like commissioned it, which I think they just funded it. And then the idea is that, oh, well, Templeton is a Christian organization, which I think they have Christian roots. I think they're more religion friendly today. I know people who have been funded by Templeton who are not Christian. I've seen them fund research that's not necessarily flattering to Christianity. So anyway, right? But that's what it's kind of supposed to tap into. But I'm more prone to call it the STEP study or the Benson et al. Study. And what is that? The study on the therapeutic effects of intercessory prayer. This was, I should know this off the top of my head. This was published in 2002. I like the study. I don't like the way it's used. Now, I think the study was really important. It advanced the field in a really significant way, and I am very grateful that it was published. Now, when we hear people talk about this study, you will often hear the claim that this study showed us that prayer doesn't work, or at least prayer is not effective for healing. And I think the way that skeptics and Christians who would want to believe in the effects of intercessory prayer, I think they both talk about it in a way that is unnecessary. And so what happened is you have three groups. You have groups that were prayed for and knew it, groups that were prayed for and did not know it, and groups that were prayed for, that were not prayed for at all. And so you have a control that's great. Well, I'll come back to this point of controlling. But you have the design is very good. It takes place at 6 hospitals. They compare their sample to general, these are cardiology patients, and it's pretty serious what's going on. They compare their patients to general information we have on cardiology patients, and they mostly match population demographics. They're a little bit less healthy than the baseline, but that shouldn't really matter if you're testing prayer from an omnipotent God, right? So I won't count that against them. And they're very straightforward about that, so I like that as well. Now, what you will often hear then is this study showed us that when you pray for people, whether you pray for people or not, they end up the same. Actually, maybe the prayed for group ended up a little bit worse. Now, the reason they're saying maybe is because that was not statistically significant. So in my own research, I would not report that as an important factor. So just being consistent, I would say, okay, you've got the stalemate here. I would not say worse. But I have one critique with how it's cited, not how it was done. They effectively, if you're testing the power of prayer itself, they probably don't effectively have a control group. If you read the discussion and conclusion section, again, the authors are very honest about this, which I respect. They note that they didn't really have an effective control protocol to see if patients were being prayed for by somebody else. And subsequent research has taken note of this, right? This is why I think this study is really important, because they let that cat out of the bag for future researchers to know. And now we know, based on future research, that when people are admitted to the hospital, you might have 80, 90, 95% of them saying, oh yeah, when I got admitted for a heart attack or heart failure, I know that my friends and family are praying for me. And so then, what the study effectively shows us is that the experimental group of people who pray did not have a special effect on praying for the patients compared to their friends and family who might have been praying at home. Because at this point, if you have 80 to 95% of cardiology patients being prayed for anyway, that's what we would call a rare event, and you would need like a first rare event bias correction statistically, something like that. And so it's not surprising to me then that the results were kind of washed out there. So what Christians have often done, or other theists, have said, well, look, the problem here is that they put God to the test. God doesn't like to be put to the test. I'm like, that's not contrived. I don't have a problem with that response per se. I think you could make even a ground up theological argument there to prevent doing the study to begin with. But I also think it's not really necessary. I see this study as a first methodological step. And as we were talking before we went live, there has been subsequent prayer research, and I would assess the state of the field today as mixed positive, that we have seen results in other studies. Now, I'm not trying to overstate it. The scientists are not saying we proved God in a lab, right? They are saying for one reason or another, we can find effects related to prayer with direct intercessory prayer, indirect intercessory prayer. That's really like, so one, like they might be laying hands and being there. One, they might be praying from a distance, and another, they might be, they call it observational. And this is interesting to me, but it has nothing to do with the miraculous. It doesn't prove the miraculous or even come close. And that's where you kind of look at populations. How often do you pray? How healthy are you? And I suppose that theists could look at that and say, oh, well, look, since the people who pray more are healthier, God must be intervening. But you have nothing in terms of mechanisms there, right? And so the STEP study is kind of a baseline for conversations that I have with a lot of people, a lot of religious people and skeptics, or religious people who are, like cessationists, right? Like people who like the idea of prayer working or don't like the idea of prayer working. They tend to start here, say it kind of closed the story, and then that was it, right? My 2 points are, hey, it was a great first step, but I would not say it's the end all be all on does prayer work or not. And 2, the field has gone, it's almost been 20 years since the STEP study, and publications keep coming out. So my modest recommendation is to let's advance the public conversation to keep up with the field. Hopefully I didn't go too long there.
No, that was awesome. Thanks for that. Very, very, I don't know if you had that planned, but you're a very, very good orator. So credit where credit is due there.
You got a good voice, man. I was going to compliment you before. You sing very well. You sound cool.
All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Gabriel should do radio. Yeah.
Oh, I don't know about that, but I guess old ministry school habits die hard, I guess. So anyways, so I think the first thing that popped out to me when I was hearing that kind of those opening thoughts was, I guess a couple of things came to mind actually, but one of them was whether or not Yeah, I think that's the one that's the most interesting. The idea of putting God to the test in these things here. Because here's what the thought that came to mind, which is if we do want to build that theology from the ground up, right? Then, and this goes to back with something we were talking about before the stream started, which is it does seem to be a critique being like, listen, this just isn't a good methodology that can tell us anything about prayer, period. And so does anyone have any thoughts about that idea that since we are in a quote, in some sense, putting God to the test, what should we expect from prayer study? Should we actually think that they are a good tool to find something about God interacting with people who are making requests for different healings and such?
Yeah, I don't personally have an issue with it as far as like theologically, as far as, where you are somehow committing a sin by putting God to the test. But I do think methodologically it's problematic because under this model, you do have to presuppose God is a free agent. And the issue, even with just in sociology studies in general, there's, the term replication crisis, because there's lots of things in the social sciences and psychology and other fields that are very hard to replicate because people can be unpredictable and there's so many factors that you just can't control for. And so I think when it comes to that, it's very hard. I don't think we can predict who God will heal and who won't God heal. We have to look at, when we look at the world and we see there's a lot of death and violence, I think we already have to assume in our hypothesis, God doesn't answer all prayers whenever, because then you wouldn't be observing the world we would be in. And so you have to at least assume that God in many cases does not answer prayer. And so I don't think we can predict who God will heal when he will heal. And so I think I have an issue with that, just as I would have an issue with predicting how free people would act in certain conditions. So I think for those reasons, I think that if we were theoretically able to, where we could show every single time people got better in prayer and stuff, I think that we would almost be dealing with like the cyclical literature, people trying to argue for like almost telepathy, or almost saying, well, our minds can actually influence matter. And so our willing it hard enough actually caused it to be affected. And maybe this is the electromagnetism in our brain, whatever, we could come up with some solution. But if we could show that people praying hard enough caused something to happen, people, I think that, and we could replicate this constantly, I think we would say that would be a better hypothesis. And it would be very hard to, in that world, to show that a miracle happened where it would stand out as significant and get people's attention. So I just think for all those reasons, we would be very skeptical to think that God would do it. I also want to just say to Kenneth, I know I mentioned this to him before, but also, have you heard people, and I'm not, this isn't my position, but and this is going to depend on your theology, but I have heard people criticize that study as well, because the people they got to pray were not like traditional continuationist Christians. I think they were either like New Age or cessationists. I don't remember which denomination it was, but they weren't like your traditional Christians that a lot of people would have preferred.
I've heard the critique before. I haven't looked too deep into like the denominations that were mentioned or anything like that. It doesn't personally do much for me. I think, and I've seen you talk about it too. I think those that, so I am one, right? To just put my cards on the table. I do believe that like miracles happen. I am a continuationist to some extent. I wouldn't say like your average charismatic or Pentecostal, but I think exceptional things do happen today. And I do think that one who advances arguments for miracles like you do, I believe, and like I am very prone to, has to account for miracles happening elsewhere. I mean, I don't think they can all be explained away. In that, it's confusing. I don't know what to do with it, but it honestly, I think it's interesting, and it's a cool world to be a part of when you see it that way. And so I don't have a prior where I am committed to, prayer from these groups not working. In some sense or another, I don't have a theological justification behind that. I'm a bad theologian, but and just so, yeah, my general approach would be like, okay, as somebody who is not a great theologian, I could see a case being made kind of inductively against like doing the step study. I'm not committed to it, but if I were to say, okay, let's pretend this never happened, right? And it was our job to determine as Christians and interested people, right, and Christians and skeptics together, okay, is this what the Bible would predict? Is this what Christian tradition would predict? And I could see that, like, you could be like, oh, you know what? Well, like, you got Elijah and the prophets, you've got miracles as signs, and that seems to be for people to see. And I could see one side saying, yeah, I think God would want to thrive in an environment like that. Then I can see the rather explicit, and I believe it appears in both testaments, do not put the Lord your God to the test. Now, I do think there is some debate about what that means, but if it presents in the original languages as it does in English, it kind of seems like now I don't have the strictest fundamentalist interpretation either of things either, but okay, that I could see why somebody who isn't just trying to explain away results they don't like would say, I don't expect that. But what I do think makes sense, and I mean, unless you have somebody who doesn't like their theology and can explain that away as well. We were talking about like, it was Candy Gunther Brown in her Mozambique study. That's looking at Heidi Baker's ministry, right?
Yes.
Okay, right. So that's not, Heidi Baker and her ministry, as far as I know, saying that, hey, we're going to put God to the test and we're going to set up to the study, right? It's more of a medical researcher said, I hear this is already happening somewhere. So let me, in a kind of, as a medical anthropologist, essentially, go out into the field and see if something's already happening there. Now, I mean, I suppose you could build a post hoc case that God closes his eyes and turns away because he's mad that the scientists got there to test him, right? But that seems a little bit more contrived to me. And it's worth noting it was a small sample study, but that did tend to yield some positive results, right?
It did, yeah. Well, quite like statistically, like I think it was tenfold, like quite statistically significant results as well. But there were issues with controls that people criticized it for.
Mm-hmm.
But,
do you remember how many patients there were?
I think it was a couple dozen, I think.
Okay.
Maybe like around, I don't know if it was like, maybe I'm pulling this out, maybe 24 or maybe less than that. Probably anywhere from like 12 to 24, but I could be wrong on that.
That sounds right to me. It is on the smaller end, I have to be honest. But if it's 10 to 20 fold or something, you're going to be getting most, if not all, cases. So it's moderately impressive. Is it airtight to me? Okay, I clearly just take I clearly haven't just read it, right, for anyone listening. But as I reflect on it, I remember thinking, hey, this is cool. This is impressive. Could someone poke holes in it? For sure, right? Is it the deal breaker? I don't think so. But that one is more not knowing anything about Heidi Baker, right? I don't know if her theology is great. My understanding is
she's a charismatic. I mean, but she's your standard.
But she's got an academic background, right? Where she got like the credentials and then went out into the field. I remember thinking that was interesting about her, and that's all I kind of knew about her. Is that a lot of these charismatic ministers like got ordained when they were 12, and then it was like straight from there. So I thought her background was interesting, right? I don't know if it's something I would resonate with, but yeah, at least on the surface of it, there's nothing theologically offensive to me about the way that study was done.
Yeah, I can send you these resources when we're done with this, Keth, but I think you'd be interested when we have further conversations about this to look into like other ministries in particular. Like I think, to my knowledge, is the only study that's been done with the ministry, but there are like published books, I think by medical presses, where I forget the presses, that deal with stuff like that. So like you can have someone like, are you familiar with Catherine Coleman? She was back in the 70s. Really big faith healer.
Was she like an itinerant faith
healer? She was pretty, she was pretty like, she was like, had big stadium stuff, but she she had a lot of like, there was a lot of quotes from doctors backing her. And there was a book published in the early 70s by a physician named William Nolan. And this isn't like a published study, but it was essentially done the same way. He went to one of her healing crusades, an event, and he kept up with all the people who said they were healed, who were on the stage and stuff. And he kept up with them. And when he looked at them, he said that either it was all placebo or they weren't actually healed. And some of them actually got worse afterwards. And so he published this.
Yeah.
And he got criticized because they were saying, well, you had a small sample size. You were only at one event and here's other stories and stuff. And so in response to that, a doctor named Richard Kasseldorf published a book with 10, because Nolan had 10 cases. Kasseldorf had 10 cases that were positive, where he found people who were at her crusades, and he has pictures of x-rays and stuff, and he spoke with their doctors, and he had 9 other physicians to review all this stuff, pretty extensive stuff. And he was basically responding to Nolan saying, well, here's other cases in which people really were healed inexplicably and stuff. So I think that's just that kind of back and forth with ministries is interesting. And maybe
very much so.
Yeah. So here's a thought. So I started the idea of, question of testing God. And I remember kind of also brought up the idea, though, that miracles, and you talked about this too, the idea of theological significance, right? Miracles is a sign, right? And I do feel like there's at least a little bit of tension between those concepts, depending on how you interpret what it means to put God to the test. So, so the biblical case that comes to mind would be something like when Moses goes to see Pharaoh, right? And so all of a sudden, God's working signs and wonders, And then it's also a case that's cited for, false miracles too. The magicians in Pharaoh's court, they also have snakes. And then at some point they stop keeping up with Moses. And so it's kind of like, oh, my God's greater than your God. But the idea being is, so in this context, it does seem that miracles are a bit of a sign. And so I think this relates back to the methodological question. So what can we say? Are these prayer studies, useful? Or are they not? And I think we could only say they're not useful if you have a theological predisposition to believe that God is such that he doesn't want you to put him to the test. And that if you do, he's going to mess up your study. So you actually have to have those two things in place. So you could even think that maybe God doesn't like this, but he'll play along with whatever it is.
Yeah, but we have studies that are positive, like they're inconsistent. So it feels weird that you're saying if God was if they were all negative, that would be one thing. You could say he's punishing you, but the fact they're inconsistent, I don't think it means he's punishing you or affirming it. I don't think it's helpful.
To the question too of the idea of general effects, right? So more than one, not just Christian denomination, but more than one religious tradition. Different religions praying and seeing some effects there as well, and kind of being like, well, I'm not exactly sure what to do with that, but like I kind of think that God could answer prayers from people with different religions. Doesn't seem to be a problem with that. But I think to the point of like, could prayer studies be effective? I do think you could absolutely have a sufficient series of prayer studies that got results that were specific enough where it seems like God would be the best explanation. And so I think specifically would be as if you can find religious exclusivism, right? So because that would it'd be weird if you're proposing a psychological mechanism, some sort of weird energy force out there doing mind over matter, something like that, causing these healings, if you're not seeing this in other religious contexts,
right.
that you're seeing it in another, right? So it's funny because it's weird hearing some of these studies that have been done from these charismatic preachers speaking up in a possibly positive manner, because that's kind of what I used to do back in the day, and I got pushback not just from skeptics, but from other Christians who are like, that's all bunk, that's all. Because if you think about it, let's say you were to show that in charismatic ministries, you're seeing these amazing effects more, and you think the theology of these charismatics is not just problematic, but can be actually dangerous or even predatory at different times, depending on the health and wealth sort of message that comes out. And being questions, well, if miracles are a sign, then what is God trying to tell us through this here? And I think it's more of a palatable conclusion to determine that, a lot of this stuff is bunk. You can't trust the studies because the theological implications are just too severe.
Yeah, that's.
Go ahead,
go ahead. No, go ahead, Kenneth. Go ahead. I talked last. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, sure. So I think it's a great point, and that's kind of where I kind of feel some like personal tension as well. I mean, I think of, and I'm not endorsing him, I'm not a fan of John MacArthur, but I just remember he had this kind of viral clip, like something like 10 years ago, where he was
Strange Fire Conference, right?
Yes. Okay, yeah. So you know what's up. That went viral for whatever reason, and he was saying, right, he had this line where he said, God doesn't work that way today. He doesn't do, sure, he might answer your prayer to cure you of a cold, but he's not going to make your tumor evaporate. He's not going to make your arm grow back. He's not going to do this and that, right? Like, God doesn't do that anymore. And if he did, this was the line that just stuck with me because it was so angry. It was like, he would never do it to confirm a perverted theology like that. And I remember that was the line. Now, I have a great respect for the big picture global Pentecostal tradition. Again, as a sociologist, there's a lot to like coming out of Azusa Street and the justice movements and that sort of a thing. There's heavy overlap with some of the liberation traditions that I'm not an expert on, but there's a lot of good stuff there, right? And then there is the prosperity, which ran, in my opinion, in the complete opposite direction, right? And so, like, to say that this is happening in charismatic Pentecostal ministries that I don't particularly belong to probably doesn't give me a great deal of tension. I would, however, worry if it were happening at some of the, more nefarious runs, right? Like, I wouldn't know what to do with a miracle happening at a Benny Hinn crusade, for example. I had a mentor who tried to go, and they wouldn't let him go and study. He said it's very hard to get in there. So I have a suspicion that there's not a lot of real things going on there. I guess my kind of ad hoc explanation would be God is honoring the person who came there with faith, who will hopefully not, Benny Hinn's not going to be their local church, right? He's going to take his show somewhere else. You could say that, and that doesn't strike me as particularly contrived, right? But it is something worth thinking about for sure. I know that other Christians, now again, for me, I can look at the Exodus narrative and you say false miracles because that is how it's often taught. I'm not committed to that, right? Like, I could be committed to a really cool kind of power show happening between Moses and the Egyptian gods, right? Like, without illusions. Maybe it wasn't Sai Baba there. I could be wrong. I could be wrong about that. It totally could be fake, right? But I'm not committed to that. But I guess where some people have issues is when you look at the Pentecostal tradition, you have a lot of things like a lot of them are modalist, a lot are oneness. These are not things I tend to get very hung up on, but I do know that these have been like labeled heresies and things outside of the church. Again, that's not my not something I'm committed to, but these are the sorts of things that I hear among like the laity who are uncomfortable with prayer testimonies coming out of these places, right? God would not confirm that. It's not as angry as MacArthur, but I hear the strange fire argument made more often than you would expect, just limited to his circle.
Yeah, no, I agree with almost everything Kenneth said, and I think that's a good point. And I talk about this a little bit in the book. Actually, I have an appendix that deals with it too. But I kind of ask, like, it's really hard to establish what the theological message is, because on the one hand, I can understand God valuing the faith of someone, even if the person they're going to is not necessarily the best person, right? Because you're right, a lot of these crusades is not a local church, so these people are usually taking planes or traveling hours in really sick conditions to see these people, and that could be a testament of their faith. They're really trusting God here and spending money and stuff. But at the same time, it's like, if God does heal them, surely this is going to only encourage the person to trust what that person is teaching, right? It'd be in most cases, they're going to be more emphatic and want to give them more money. And so it's a really weird balance for me. And it's funny that he brought up Benny Hinn, because there actually is I'll send you the PDF as well. There actually is a book that was published in the early 90s of, I think, talks about 10 of Hinn's miracles. And he does have a medical doctor review it in the preface, and he does have medical documentation. And some of these are things like cancer that can remit on their own, but some of these are like blindness and pretty impressive stuff, and certain degrees that I can't explain easily. And so part of me wants to say, well, this is bunk because I don't trust Hinn, but it's also like, well, if there is hard data, I don't see why God couldn't heal a person. So it is a very fine line. But I will say that when you talk about getting into his things, it is hard, because there have been people, including his own Costi Hinn is a pastor now. He's his nephew. He used to work for him, and he and other people have all said that they have a lot of times they will have people who vet people there. So people, like, if someone has arthritis and they're in pain, they will let them go up to the stage. But if someone comes who's like has cerebral palsy in a wheelchair and has like clubbed hands, they won't let them go on stage. Like the people who are suspiciously really, really, really sick, who you think would be like almost certainly to fail, they don't let them. So that would obviously give you pause. But to the MacArthur thing, I like what you brought up about the social justice thing, because I think it's a little bit of a thing of, there's no one. I'm not denominational, but I don't think there's one perfect denomination. I think every denomination has things that I don't like about it. I don't like the prosperity gospel and the charismatic movement, but at the same time, as much as I don't like the charismatic movement, they did a lot of good things at the Azusa Street, because they were one of the first American churches to integrate. And they actually got criticized in the early 1900s because, they were having colored and white people in the same church together. How terrible, that was really controversial for the day. And meanwhile, I was raised Baptist. The Baptist church has a really racist history in America, unfortunately. And so
the SBC is still dealing with some of that stuff.
Yeah, and that's in my home city of Louisville, Kentucky, too. There's still controversy about, we have dorms and statues of people who own slaves and all that. So I'm very hesitant to try to pull the moral high ground of saying, well, you do all this unethical stuff. John MacArthur literally actually just had, I don't know if you've seen, he just got in trouble for a scandal with miscommunicating a woman who divorced her husband because he molested their children and abused her, and he got on her for not taking him back and all that. So I feel like it's just like a little bit of a high horse of saying, like, are we really going to be trying to say, oh, your church is bad? And one last thing is, like, in a lot of these like third world countries, it's not like they have 10 different options to go to. A lot of these places, this is what they have. This is what church is. And especially like in the Middle East, you'll hear a lot of these stories about like Jesus appearing to Muslims and converting them in visions. And I've heard John MacArthur and other people saying, well, Jesus is sending them to bad churches because look at where he sends them to. It's like, well, those are the only churches in those areas. How many, they don't have, in Saudi Arabia, they don't have 10 different denominations just to go check on. A lot of these are in secret. And so I think that we're just trying to play cards here. And I just really don't like that argument.
Yeah, I mean, it's beam in the eye problem for sure, right? Or it's like, what like you said, I'm likewise non-denominational, and there are things in every denomination I don't like, and like what is it? I don't think anyone, I don't even think MacArthur's theology probably commits him to that would be an endorsement of the entire thing, right? I mean, yeah, it could be, as a Mexican American, right? Like, I think what Azusa Street did was really good for our people. And okay, maybe they have an improper theology of miracles, maybe, right? But God wanted to endorse the social theology. I don't know. I'm kind of a skeptical theist. I don't have like divine psychology in my mind, but that seems like a reasonable thing to me, right? That he wanted to confirm, he wanted to affirm the justice narrative, and he was going to, look away from the missing the mark on charismatic theology. or miracle theology, and he sent MacArthur's church into scandal because he was being a jerk. Even though he had the perfect alignment of leaky dispensationalism or whatever he calls it, right? Like, I mean.
But one other thing,
do that after he has all those Larry King appearances.
I know, Larry King.
Cursed for taking good slots on Larry King.
One other thing I wanted to say, and I think this is actually a good transition to the next part. We're going to talk about individual cases. I was going to bring up Catholicism because I'm not Catholic, obviously, right. And there's some really interesting stuff. But the question with that is, and I've heard people make the connection, is how much of the theology is tied to it? Because in Catholicism, you'll have cases of people praying for the intercession of saints and being healed. And this is actually how they confirm people in the church. To be a saint, you have to have at least 2 miracles on your behalf. It used to be 4, now it's 2 on your behalf. And they have, the Vatican has a medical council that reviews this. All of this cats. It's cute. And Gabriel probably go into this a little bit because I believe Gabriel's case is at Lourdes, and Lourdes has a similar structure set up. But it's like, this is they consider this, if the person's inexplicably healed, that this is a miracle on the person's behalf, and this is proof that they're beatified in heaven. And so that's why this is criteria they use to prove the person is now in heaven and able to intercede. And so it's like, do I have to take that view? And if I can, is God doing this? But does God know by doing this if this is false, that this is going to be interpreted in this way? Same with Lourdes. Like, if God is healing these people in Lourdes just for the sake of it, and he doesn't want them to believe, because they think the Virgin Mary is healing them because she allegedly appeared there in the 1800s. Does God know that they're going to attribute this to him? Does he just not care? Or there are theoretical ways he could do this, and he could have people only be healed by Protestant stuff, but it depends on how much. Again, it depends on how much you think each denomination is wrong. The ones that are really tough, I think, are the ones where they affirm a very specific doctrine or people are converted. So, like Fatima, I don't personally hold to Fatima, but Fatima, not only does the Virgin Mary appear, but she says, "I am the Immaculate Conception." So that seems to be affirming a very specific doctrine. Or you'll have Eucharist miracles where the wafer literally turns into the blood of Christ. Now, could God do that theoretically? If God is doing that and does not believe in transubstantiation, that's really weird. Or you could look at there's a Catholic named Joseph Cupertino who was very well known for levitating. Really, really interesting sources. And there's one narrative of him of a Protestant visiting and him denying the power of the church. And then Joseph levitates, and the guy's like, gets on his knees like, "Oh, I've been wrong," and he ends up converting to Catholicism. It's like, so if this is God doing this, why is he converting people to these specific ones? But it goes both ways, because I know of a missionary. I don't actually trust this account because he got in trouble with a lot of financial scandals later on, so his credibility is kind of iffy. But presuming that he was right, because there are other stories like this, he had a story of going to Indonesia and doing all these miracles, and he goes to a Catholic church in Indonesia, and he tells them that their idol, he's very charismatic, very Protestant, their idols are sinful, right? You have all these idols of saints and Mary. God doesn't worship idols. And he prays and he calls down fire, and fire consumes these Catholic idols. It's like, if that happened and God did it, like, is he not kind of seeming to pick sides here? At least it seems really weird on both sides. So that to me is really interesting. And the cases that I will get into, and I think that Gabriel might as well, I think both of us have Catholic cases, and I talk a little bit about that, is like, I don't really know what to do with this. And this doesn't actually even agree with my theology, but I'm trying to be as open as I can. So I'll just leave it at that. If Gabriel wants to say anything or transition to the next part.
Plus, first of all, for openness, I don't think it's good to hurt people for being open. So I think it's a good thing. It's all of us should be engaging in that, and we're all going to have weak points when it comes to things that may not look good for our side. But I don't care about how my side looks. I care about my beliefs, trying to be as accurate as possible. So yeah, so Catholic cases are interesting, and this gets, I think, overall to what we were talking about, theological significance of the question. And Kenneth, you even brought up the idea of skeptical theism, right? I think you can conceive of some versions of skeptical theism, right, where it's like, I feel like we're actually kind of throwing up our hands up in the air and throwing it to mystery in some sense when it comes to these miracles. Like, maybe we just don't know what theological significance is. You can come up with some stories, and I think at the end of our stream, right, last time, I mentioned a couple of broad themes that, like, maybe you can come up with some sort of minimal divine psychology idea, right? Like, God maybe generally cared for the development of Western civilization because of the values. Kind of, you even mentioned justice values in the Azusa Street, right? So maybe God's working in those kinds of general ways. Maybe God just cares of specific instances of compassion, and God can choose when he wants to do that and when he doesn't want to do that. God, we don't know every person's life. God does. So you can come up with things along those natures. And Caleb got the point about Catholicism, because I think that was interesting as well. So I think when it comes to miracles, I think it's difficult because these issues seem to be issues depending if you happen to hold a specific theological tradition, right? So they don't seem to be problems with the whether or not we can believe that miracles happen in and of themselves, right? You can have different positions that don't work with those theological positions we've brought up, and you could still believe that miracle cases have happened. And I think that is pretty important. And maybe I'll do a little bit of skeptical pushback because I'm trying to be. So a couple thoughts, I've made posts on this in the past, is this seems to be, if we were going to posit, miracle claims happening and miracle claims, maybe we believe ultimately these are caused not miraculous. These are not miraculous. There's natural explanations for these things, right? It kind of makes sense that you would see theological confusion. It kind of makes sense that you would see not just that you would see theological confusion, but you would see, or maybe that was, so that's that's correct. So you would see theological confusion, right? And so that you would appeal to the best explanation for that would be is that, well, ultimately it's just naturally explained. But you could also kind of have sort of a everything goes, God works, and you could call it like a New Age theology or something like that. Like, oh yeah, man, everything kind of happens this way, and that idea of miracles, you kind of have a permissive epistemology when it comes to miracles, right? Oh yeah, I kind of believe this miracle here, and God's not so worried about your labels, about if you know the exact truth, He wants you to live a good life and stuff, and God's just helping be kind and be making the world a better place in these things, and that kind of theology is totally compatible with all sorts of weird miraculous things happening that don't work with particular theological traditions. But so I think we can move on to particular cases, but did anyone else have a particular thought on that point before we did?
I just think it's helpful to be mindful of, for how much of history, like we brought up the Catholic case, for example, and I'm like Caleb, I'm not personally Catholic. I'm not particularly offended by Catholicism. I'm just certain I can't make the history line up, and that's it. I don't have any strong views, right? So I'm not averse to miracles in the Catholic Church, but there are certain areas where it might affirm a particular truth claim I believe in. But I think it's also important to reminder that for much of history, Roman Catholicism was the default church for a lot of people, not for everybody, but for a lot of people, it was the default church. It is still the default church today, right? So for in certain countries and in certain communities. So I could still see revelation within that context as a general revelation of God. I think too, it matters, what are the relevant, I guess, theological imperfections, because we all have them. And if that's the benchmark full stop, then nobody's going to have their prayers answered, I don't believe. And I have a particular view of the Bible where I think that most of our examples, Jesus, the exception, are deeply, deeply flawed and deeply, deeply flawed on purpose, right? And so, I think that apart from the signs of Christ, every miracle case is an example of that. Moses are, after, murdering someone in the desert, right? Elijah's are, and I think Elijah's deeply flawed, but a great example, but deeply flawed in other ways. I think Jonah is a buffoon, right? And Jonah's a discernment blogger. He's angry at God for being nice to people, right? And yet there's a miracle there, and I'm kind of convinced that that's actually a resurrection miracle. That he was dead as doornails inside that well. How do you survive in the well? You don't. But and even if it's a metaphor, a divine comedy, whatever, right? The message there, it still has miracles in the midst of people who are intentionally portrayed to us as deeply flawed. And so I don't think it's the word of the day, I guess, is contrived. I don't think it's too contrived for us to posit, God's going to work in some places that I wouldn't work. And then my goal is to not be Jonah and scream at God for being nice in the wrong place.
Yep. And it's interesting. I'll invite one of my friends back from ministry school days, Jonathan. He's been moved away from some of the theological stuff, but yeah, he's moved more towards that different interpretations of the Bible. I guess you consider him more of a Randall Rouser type Christian in that sense. But so I guess we could go ahead and get into some cases if you guys are cool with that. Did anyone have questions too about, I guess we talked about miracle. We talked about prayer studies in general a little bit. It seemed like, men, correct me if I'm wrong, we're maybe that there are some points in favor or consistent with this idea that God is answering the prayers, and we're seeing that in the study, but that there's also sufficient ambiguity where someone could be skeptical of that. Does that seem like a fair assessment overall? All right, cool. All right, so I'll go ahead and just get started here. I So one case that came to mind when I was looking at like what would be interesting cases, my thought process is that hopefully we'll get at different criteria that people might have conflicting intuitions on, being like, oh, I think this is really good, that in favor of a miracle claim being more likely to be true, that yeah, a miracle did in fact happen, or certain criteria being like, this is more reason to be to be skeptical, being like, yeah, it's probably a mark against it. And so I picked a case from Lourdes. The gentleman's name is John Pierre Belly. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. But so this is a case that happened at Lourdes. Basically what happened was this is a man who's 51 years old. What's basically being reported is that he was cured instantly of multiple sclerosis after having completed a trip to Lourdes. What happened was, let's see if we can get to my notes here. My apologies on that. Oh yeah, so some of the facts about his sclerosis, so you know the background information on that. So he was born August 24th, 1936. He was a nurse working with a lot of anesthesia. And in 1972, he began to suffer a neurological incapacity, which he basically resulted in multiple sclerosis, they diagnosed him as. And in 1984, he was walking with a cane. In 1985, he required a wheelchair. 2 years later, he was bedridden. And some of the marks that I think might be in favor is he was receiving 100% invalidity pension and allowance, right? So he's getting money for having this here. Someone's had to come in and verify this is something that happened. In October 1987, he went on pilgrimage to Lourdes. And then he was celebrating the sacrament of reconciliation. And I guess they have a sick room in Lourdes. So he was in the sick room and they were doing that on October 8th. And he received the sacrament of the sick. And so then this is the next day, the next part happens. The next day during Mass in the Rosary Square, he was overcome by a powerful sense of interior liberation and peace. So some sort of spiritual experience, mystical experience happened there. Something he had never experienced before. And then one more day following, on Friday, October 9th at midday, while he was lying in the sick room still, he experienced a cold sensation, which became strong and slightly painful, which then led to feelings of warmth that grew in intensity. And then he sat on the edge of his bed and he was able to move his arms. As he went to sleep that night, he went to a deep sleep. He woke up and he discovered that he could walk for the first time since 1984. And I believe this is in 1987 that this happened now. And at the end of the pilgrimage, he traveled. So he went to, at that point, then he goes home, boards a train. People see him and people testify that this is an amazing thing that happened. It was officially declared a miracle, this case. He presented his case to the Medical Bureau of Lourdes the following year. And he has been seen annually by his doctors and his neurologist to confirm that this fact has gone away. The first consultation on this case happened in 1992 at the request of an international medical committee of Lourdes. So this is the one that assesses. They have a very high threshold. There's a lot of cases that are presented, and a lot of cases that get thrown out every year at Lourdes. And after the second examination of this case by them, the conclusion is such a cure is not unusual, but inexplicable. Such a cure is not just unusual, but inexplicable. And the committee called for a further 2-year delay to respect the criteria of a definitive cure. So they want to make sure that the effect was prolonged. So this happened and persisted. And then after more examinations and consultations, the majority vote on that council made a statement, and they stated the following: it is possible to conclude with a good margin of probability that Mr. Belly suffered an organic infection of the multiple sclerosis type in a severe and advanced stage of which the sudden cure during a pilgrimage to Lourdes corresponds with an unusual and inexplicable fact to all the knowledge of science. It is impossible for medical science to say anything more today. It is for the religious authorities, however, to make a pronouncement on the other dimensions of this cure. So they're not necessarily ruling out that something natural could have happened, but they said that it's inexplicable, or if there's a natural mechanism that God may have been involved with that happening and resulting in his miraculous recovery. So that is the general case, and I expect all of you to have that memorized after I just rambled for that long period of time. But yeah, so that's the case. Did you guys have any initial thoughts on it that popped into your mind?
Can I ask a question? So I'm partially familiar with, I mean, I'm familiar with Lourdes, and I'm familiar with some of the cases. I didn't look that much into this particular one because there's 70 different ones, right? So, so I guess my question would be, if I was starting to play skeptic, would be, when he started walking, was he walking completely unaided the next day, or was he like, did he go from like bedridden to a cane and then gradually got better, or was this like instantaneous, he could walk again? Because that would, to me, make a difference. Because if it's like instantaneous walk again, that's actually pretty unusual. So I don't know if it specifies.
For the ordering of the experiences that he mentioned, so he mentioned first those sensations, right? The cold and the pain, and then the warmth. And then he just had movement in his arms initially, I believe it was. And then it was after he went to sleep the next morning, he discovered he could walk. By the time he reached the train, so let's see. So it said at the end of the pilgrimage. So he did travel to that station in his wheelchair. So it seems like
after he was cured or before he was cured?
Well, after he said he discovered he could walk. So he had those feelings. He could move his arms. He went to sleep and he woke up. He discovered he could walk for the first time since 1984. And then at the end of the pilgrimage, he still traveled to the station in his wheelchair. So maybe he could have some walking function. Maybe he's not very strong in walking. So it's unclear. And then so as not to appear different from his companions in sickness, by the time he reached the train, he decided to enter alone and remain seated.
So he looks the same by the time he gets to the train. Is that what you said? He fits in a crowd. Is it?
No, so he was in his wheelchair, but so I guess there's a lot of people who come to Lourdes, right?
Oh, there are a lot of thousands of people.
Like, oh my goodness, when there's all these people who are sick, and be that person, right? It's like, hey, I got healed, you guys didn't.
Oh, okay.
So I think that's what happened. So he kind of went to the back. He sat down, and then when he had regained complete. It just says after that he regained complete use of his physical faculties and medical.
So that sounds like it's a fairly gradual. Like usually when you say regain,
fairly gradual, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think even the ordering of the experiences he went through at Lourdes, right? So that wasn't even all at once, right? So he had received the sacrament of the sick. The next day he went to Mass in Rosary Square, and that's where he had his beautiful spiritual experience. And then subsequently, this is in his room later where he feels those sensations, and then he gets his arm movement back. He sleeps, and then he gets some leg movement. So that's kind of the progression that happens.
So I guess my initial thoughts on this, if I would be, so there's a couple things on both sides, and I do this in my presentation too. So I'm trying to play both sides. So on the one hand, if I was going to be skeptical, I would say, well, the fact that this happened gradually, he had this experience, then the next day, and the fact that he still was in a wheel, even if he didn't need the wheelchair, he had some movement. I would say the fact that this is gradual would imply this is some kind of natural process that's working in the long run, and that this would be it. And another thing would be that multiple sclerosis is actually one of the conditions that does go into remission. So there are times it is well known that people who have multiple sclerosis will have times where they get improvement. If I was going to be on the apologist side, I would say, at least to my knowledge, now I'm saying this as a layman, I have looked at some of the literature, but I'm not a doctor, so I could be wrong, but I'm not aware of a case of multiple sclerosis remitting in that worse of a stage. Like there are, there's different variations. Some people have it where they just have this trouble walking, but if they're like in a wheelchair, which it sounded like it was getting worse. He had trouble walking, then he had a cane, then he had a wheelchair. If it was, and then bedridden, we couldn't even move. I'm not aware of a case remitting that's been that severe before, and it also just depends on how the speed is what is also, I think, one of the criteria why it's relevant. Like if he went to Lourdes and the next day he jumped out of his bed and was like completely, that would be it, because you also have muscle atrophy, right? If you don't walk in years, your muscles are going to be deteriorated. So that's, and there are cases like that, not at Lourdes, but I do know of a case of a woman named Barbara Snyder who had, I don't want to, derail it with another case, but she had multiple sclerosis as well. And she was in hospice care dying. She was on a ventilator because her lung was collapsed. She was blind. Her hands were curled like that. She was in a fetal position. She hears what she thinks is the voice of Jesus, and she instantly gets up, takes the ventilator out, starts walking around, and her family walks in and they see that her calf muscles are back, even though she had stick legs, like within a few minutes. And she sees the doctor the very next day, and the X-ray shows her lung is completely fixed. Like that is like instantaneous, and that's not with a normal remission. Usually remissions, you have to go to physical therapy and you get better and stuff like that. And another thing I would say on the apologist side would be that typically remissions are temporary. So you have good days and bad days. You'll get better, then they'll come back. And so I'm glad that they waited. They kept delaying it because they were probably waiting to see if it would get worse again. And I think, as far as we know, he's never gotten back and went back into his state. So the fact that it would remit permanently, I think that's also unusual. So I'll leave it at that. I know that the majority votes, I believe, I remember Peter May, who's a Christian doctor, but he's critical of healing cases. He brings this one up briefly, and he mentions that when they were voting, I think it was all except for one, and the one who voted against it was a neurologist. And the neurologist is like a specialist in those kinds of diseases. And so May thought that was troubling. That it's like, well, the one specialist in this was the one who voted against it being inexplicable. But so I would just, that's me trying to lay it out on both sides as being as fair as I can. I would say that I don't know. I would probably lean it towards it being a miracle, as I think it's pretty impressive, but that wouldn't be like my go-to, I think, evidentially most strong, but it is interesting, at least.
There's also the issue of timing, right? Where it's like, it's along with the pilgrimage, it's around with the seeking of divine favor and that sort of a thing. Like of all the times for him to go into remission, why is it, alongside that? I had some other questions. I guess too, the gradual thing, right? I've heard other ministers talk about this, and I guess it depends on like, what do you propose the mechanism, right? Like, I'm not a specialist in MS. I know a little bit about it, right? So I guess, okay, if the healing is that God comes in and removes the condition itself, stops or reverses the demyelination or whatever, then okay, you don't have MS anymore, right? You are cured of MS, but in some sense, muscle atrophy, the way you walk on your feet, and it conditions how the rest of your bones work, right? That might be a separate action, a separate miracle. It's kind of hard because I've heard of other ministers talking about this too, right? Where they'll explain, well, something really inexplicable happened, and then it took her a couple of days to get walking, but then 30 years later or whatever.
Yeah, and I don't think inexplicability is itself. I mean, that's part of it, obviously, but you can have cancer remissions that we don't know why, but then you can find correlations with. So we don't exactly know why cancer remits, but we can say like lung cancer remits more than, or like breast and lung cancer remit faster, more often than brain cancer does. People who get infections and viruses tend to go into remission more often than people who don't. So although we don't know for sure, you can find a correlation between some of those to say, well, that to me would tip it off being more natural. And that's why I said the gradual things. We know that the immune system is a process. We know that cells are working to repair disease. We know that this takes, if you theoretically knew every cell, you could estimate how long they would heal by the speed of it and all that. Of course we don't, but we know that it's a general process. So someone being healed like instantly would be, not just because we don't know, but because it's so counter to everything we know about how the immune system works. It would be it would be a really way. Same with like muscle atrophy. If muscle atrophy was instantaneous, we have a good understanding how fast muscle forms. That would be very, very unusual. Same with like a broken bone. If someone broke a bone and was healed the very next day, even though bones heal naturally, that they don't heal that fast naturally because we know how long it takes to do that. So that's why that's a relevant factor. And so that to me is, and I think one of Lourdes' standards is instantaneous, but I guess it just, I agree with Lourdes' standards, but people just wonder how they're applying them is the question. Like, well, how are we defining instantaneous? Does it have to be like the same day? Is it overnight? Is it like faster than normal? Like, what does that even mean? So that's I think where it's debated as far as that. But
right, and I think I'll jump in here because one thing that's so you could. I like how Caleb, you were trying to come at it from like a more skeptical perspective versus more of a religious perspective. So the first thing that I was thinking about in these kinds of case studies, if I'm a skeptic, there's two kinds of objections that I would raise. There's two categories of objections that I would think about when assessing miracle claims. The first category would be, okay, given the facts being reported, can we come up with decent natural explanations of these things, right? And then the other one is, can we question the sources themselves? And so I think one thing that, because I think just about any skeptic, once they come across enough miracle claims, are going to come to one claim at least where they're like, okay, I don't know what the heck is going on here. It doesn't mean it wasn't natural, but I don't know what the heck is going on here, right? And so you could just leave it at that. But some people will also get at is something to the effect of, so I think frequency is a criteria that will come to play here, right? So how often is that happening that we get to those cases like, I have no idea what's going on there. And one thing that might reduce the frequency in some skeptics' minds would be appealing to something like, okay, we're reporting miracles. How detailed, how much can we trust the exact perfect detailed story that's being conveyed to us here? And I thought Lourdes was interesting, right? Because I think it's better sourcing than most miracle claims you're going to get.
Sure. Well, and Lourdes does a pretty good job of that's because there is so much, them reviewed.
Right.
I think that's good.
But let's just think skeptically for a second, right?
Yeah.
I'm not in the room. I don't think this. So if I was going to come up with the best sort of lines of evidence for something happening, like if you got a camera in the room, right, and you saw him, he was waving his arms around, he started walking back and forth a little bit and stuff like that. At least then you okay, I know that, I can't even question that. If I'm a skeptic, I'd be maybe the timeline's a little bit off. So if how long it took for the miracle to happen does matter, that would be something that I might start questioning. And so I think it's an open question because I don't know how much we should weigh these kinds of reports, because the part of me that's trying to be reasonable in mine is I don't like the idea of just being every time you see a miracle claim, it's okay, there's probably something wrong with the sourcing. Okay, there's probably something wrong with the sourcing over and over and over again. And so that's the one thought. And then I think something else that came to my mind is I'll come back to frequency, but one more thing about how long it took. I'll put them together. So I think if you had a bunch of cases and reported miracles where you had that instant kind of frequency and you never had that anywhere else, I'm going to start taking that way more seriously, right?
Right.
But if we can bring reasonable doubt on most of those cases, and then you have one or more cases where, wow, this is weird, this happened rather instantaneously, and that's crazy. But if you were going to say, okay, from a naturalist perspective, there's some sort of unknown mechanism behind this that's causing these things, right? And on a spectrum, right, you're going to have cases where it's going to be happening at this rate, and then at this rate, and at this rate, at the very, very ends of your distribution. Right, you're going to have a couple of weird cases, right, where it's boom, it happens like that.
That's absolutely.
And so, yeah, exactly. Yeah, it kind of from a social sciences background. I'm a psych major. That's all we do.
Cool,
the only math we do is distributions.
Okay, yeah, that's perfect.
But, so that's the thoughts that came to mind for me.
I think it depends on what it is, though, right? If the range is a week to a month, and someone gets better in 3 days, that's one thing. But if the minimum that we know is let's say 3 weeks to 2 months of a recovery, and someone gets better in a few hours, instantly, that I think is a big enough. It depends on how big the outlier is, I think, and that would be.
Well, this is where I think frequency matters, right? So let's say we had 2 miracle reports, and we only had 2 miracle reports where it happened within that time frame, right? I would be much more inclined to thinking that there's some sort of unknown natural explanation, where say we didn't have this outside of some sort of religious context. But in those religious contexts, maybe we had I don't know. And again, so this is where my intuitions, I don't have a firm answer on this. But say we had 50 cases where that happened. I'm going to be okay, there's something going on here that I need to know about. I'm going to start taking that religious. And so somewhere between that 2 and 50, there's a line that's for me in my evidence. I'm I lean more one way than the other. If
the 50 were only in religious context and we didn't have anything comparable outside,
right?
That would be where it'd be
outside of that religious context is paramount to me. If we are seeing that outside of it, like you said, you mentioned remissions and stuff that. That happens.
But it's the extent of the remission. So it depends on how quickly it is, right? So that's why it's relative. It is true that the stuff goes into remission, but that's cancer goes into remission, but that we have pretty good understanding that takes at least several weeks to months with chemotherapy. Without chemotherapy, it takes longer. But if someone is cancer-free in 2 days after being prayed, and we can affirm that they were stage 4 dying cancer on Monday and that they were completely healthy. They were prayed for on Tuesday, completely healthy on Wednesday. that would be pretty strange, right? I mean, you know, I'm not saying that it couldn't be explained naturally, but if you had several cases like that and it was only cases of prayer, we did any examples of that outside of religious context, and I think I would agree with you that would be pretty unusual.
I think of the issue of like mechanisms here too, right? Where like this case, okay, it is requiring us that when you bring up to fill in some gaps, and depending on how you fill those in, they become more. The case can become more or less impressive. I'm wondering then. Okay, he certainly had a dramatic healing, right? He certainly had an interesting one. He certainly had a rare one, right? Like it now, is it only explained by God? You know, that's the $1 billion question. I guess then, like, what is the mechanism that fits the data? And me not knowing enough about MS, you know, I'm relying on intuition. You use that word, and I resonated with that a lot. Where I keep going back to the timing now. So if the timing is relevant, maybe I'm wrong about that, but it seems like, okay, he's someone who's had MS for a long time, has clearly wanted to be healed of MS for a long time. Prayers in the past apparently didn't do it, and medicine in the past apparently didn't do it. Of course, not to impose a straw man, right? They would not say we can cure your MS, so I'm not calling him a failure. But okay, so then if the Lord's treatment does it, right? Then I guess you've got the natural, you know, what the miracle experiencer says, right? God did it, right? Like that's the proposed mechanism there. And so then as I test the alternative, then I want to know what happened, right? Was it just a fluke of history, which as outliers happen, it's not impossible, right? That he was going to go into remission, and he would have gone into remission at home if he just decided not to go to Lourdes that weekend, right? I mean, I can't definitively rule that out. Or, you know, is there a mechanism where adrenaline or something psychosomatically can push your MS into remission? I think, you know, I don't want to do God of the gaps. I also don't want to do unexplained science of the gaps. And I think these are both pitfalls we could fall into if we wanted to be too dogmatic, you know, in either direction. And it's, you know, it's very clear what I want to believe happened there, right? I want to believe there's a God who loves us and heals us. But I think there is, you know, in any one of these cases, right? There's always interpretation in everything, right? There's even, you know, equations, you make applications. And it's just like, for me, I'm just asking myself, am I being too interpretive in this direction? Am I being too interpretive in that direction? I do find it a little bit compelling to the neurosurgeon, the neuroscientist case too. That I would love to have heard like what that person's
I don't know. Right? I don't know as to why he didn't.
It could have been personal disposition, or it could have been purely scientific, and it would be wrong for me to impose either. You know, anything. I would hope it's purely. I would hope it's purely scientific, and I would imagine these people are vetted, right? But I also
they're also not all Christians either, which is a good thing. They're not all, and that's and that's good. But I do know of cases of people where their doctor will verify they were healed, but they will just say this is a strange anomaly, and they were very much against calling it a miracle. But they do say, I admit that I can't explain this. I've never seen anything like it. But they personally were not wanting to use the word miracle and stuff. So it just depends. I think there is some doctor bias on both sides. There are ones who are too readily available to say, this is a miracle because they themselves are religious, and there's also ones I think who are too hesitant. But I think the question, I think we need to look at more just, okay, what are the facts, putting aside, were they healed, and do we have a good understanding of why they were healed? I think is the main question. If the answer is yes or no, then that's going to affect how we look at it. And that's the nice thing with Lourdes is Lourdes medical years not explicitly say this was a miracle. That's not their job. Their job is to say whether or not they think it's inexplicable. And then the Bishop of Lourdes, that institution is the one who then affirms it as a miracle based on what the Bureau tells them. So they don't just say, oh yeah, God did it, we can't explain it. That's the job of the religious authorities. Their job is just to vet out the ones they don't think are reliable, which is most of them. And that's also why there's 70, which 70 is a lot, but compared to, it's been there since the mid 1800s, and there's thousands of people go there every year who say they get healed. 70 is it's far less than 1%. So they're vetting, and that's because they're vetting these out pretty strictly. Like I can applaud them for at least, waiting. They usually wait minimum 10 years, I think is the standard now, but they usually wait a while before they make that judgment, because they want to make sure the person doesn't go sick again. They want to make sure they're doing follow-ups.
Well, the rate of Lourdes miracles has gone down, I think, since they've been more strict on the criteria. I believe that. So reflects that a change in the methodology.
That's true, and a lot of those come from the 1800s, where admittedly, this is before we had X-rays, and a lot of this is a lot of these people who maybe misdiagnosis could be the thing and all that. So it depends. Now, some of them, I think the more impressive ones are ones where it's like very hard, like it's like a woman with like a clubbed foot that instantly straightened. Like you can't really misdiagnose that, and it doesn't really take an X-ray to be able to see that. Like it's just, so some of them. Another one was a woman who had a I think it was like lupus, but her face was like eaten away and just was cartilage. And after she came out of the water, it was like completely normal. Like stuff like that, it doesn't take, modern science. That's pretty obvious visually. But most of the time, if it's like a cancer or neurological disease and stuff, that does take more expertise diagnosis. And there have been
wheelchair stuff too, right? I mean, that's the easiest one for like the faith healing ministry today, because we do know the adrenaline is the mechanism there, right?
Yeah.
Like somebody in a wheelchair given enough adrenaline and not enough, injury can get up and run around for a while, right? Like,
yeah, that's why follow-up's important though. Are they still healed when we check up on them again?
Right.
Are they still, and that's, and a lot of them too, also, like I've heard of ones where they'll do this, where they'll have someone who comes in with like a cane, let's say, and they'll, and their ushers will say, oh, would you be more comfortable in a wheelchair? Let's get you one to do it. And then when they come up and stand, oh my gosh, they can walk. Well, they could actually do that before, but they're kind of like, they're not, I don't want to say they're lying, but they are being misleading, or they're exaggerating how sick they were. And it depends on what they do, because most people in wheelchairs are not completely paralyzed. I mean, some of them, some of them are absolute quadriplegics, but most of them,
and deaf. You could be legally blind but still be able to see a little bit. You can exploit that on stage.
You can see some, you can see a little bit. It depends on how severe it is.
But if you're in control of the stage there and you're able to do that there, can you see this over here? Can you see that? Oh my gosh, then you usher them off the stage. So there's tricks of, unfortunately, I know some.
Which is why it's nice to do like ice, when they actually have like cases where it's like, miracles for sale. Yeah, and he has a show.
Miracles for sales, and his special is miracles. And I hope everything's okay. I'm just looking at the live screen. Oh no, okay. We're still live.
Good.
So let me ask this then. Is it fair to say that our criteria for believing that a miracle happened is that we don't have a known natural explanation for it, and that we don't see the same thing happening outside of a religious context, even if we don't know the natural mechanism?
I think it's that it doesn't resemble. I would say it doesn't resemble a natural mechanism. Not just that we don't know and it could be one, but that it doesn't. With what we know how natural mechanisms work, these things are supposed to be repeatable, and stuff like that. So if we could say we don't know what it is, we could find some kind of correlation, like I said with the cancer example, where there's some like, people of this age are more likely to be healed and prayed than the people that would be one thing. But it's more just the idea that it's instantaneous. It's permanent. This doesn't otherwise, as far as we know, go into remission. So this is only being healed in a religious context. So I think it's accumulation of things. Is it permanent? Is it complete? Like, did they get a little bit better? Did they get completely better? Was this instant? Was this immediate? Was this something that's otherwise incurable? Was this organic and not psychological? I think all of that needs to be taken. So if you have, it is, it was fast, but it was incomplete. I think it's a cumulative thing. So if you can, the more boxes you can check off, the more confident we can be, and that's what we're looking for. So I hesitate to say it's either a yes or no. I think it's more very likely, probably, maybe, probably not, almost certainly not, kind of like that scale. I would probably put that one as anywhere from a maybe to a probably, but I wouldn't go any more than that.
The skeptical part of my brain is going off, and so I'll throw a couple of thoughts your direction and get your reactions to these. Okay. All right. So what's interesting for me when I'm hearing these cases, so I kind of initially mentioned the idea of like a distribution, right? And so I think if I am being skeptical here, the couple moves that I would want to make is, again, talking about the source and how much can we know about this. And so, because there's some fuzziness here, right? So we have to admit that, right? We're dealing with probabilities. We do not know 100%, every little iota in every little case, right? So the first move as a skeptic, I think that I would kind of make would be that, again, miracles are still very rare. So I think rarity does come into play here, right? So the first thing I would say is that we can still explain a lot of these things from just bad reporting. It's just like maybe like it wasn't as severe as people said it was. There's a multiple different ways we could talk about it. There's a misdiagnosis. Someone lied. There wasn't a club foot, right? So if you go into the agent, because that's kind of what you have to do. Like if you're saying that, it's like, well, you can't just misdiagnose a club foot. Yeah, you could lie about it. And so I also am curious what people's intuitions are. If
and that depends on how many witnesses. Like if they said they had a club, but if you have like many people there said, yeah, I saw them with it, and they had a doctor. Like I think in that case, they had a doctor's note. But what was that?
We have a report of that, right? So it's like how much corroboration you could always ask. So I like, for example, maybe this is my bias here. I would tend to think of like a report from the 1800s. Generally speaking, I would be more skeptical of that than say one that happened in the 1880s, 1990s, 2000s, that. So that's the first move I think I would make. I think the second one, though, is a little more interesting. Is I think you have to appeal. You might need to appeal I'll see if you guys agree with this or not, or if you think this is a move that's plausible, makes sense to make, to underreporting of weird things happening outside of a religious context, right? So the idea is, if you have a place called Lourdes, right, and you have a healing room, you're most likely going to make notes when things happen, right? But if you went to a doctor and they say, hey, your cancer is terminal, it's brain cancer, it's bad, and you stop going to your doctor for 6 months and all of a sudden you go into remission, and then you don't start going for a checkup until 3 or 4 years later or something like that, there might never be a report that's filled out as a case study that's published being like, hey, look at this amazing thing that happened here. There's some sort of naturalistic mechanism going on we don't understand. And so now that's still an appeal to something we don't know. So we don't know that is happening. Right. But I think that is a move that someone might attempt to make. And so what do you guys think about those couple of moves?
Yeah, I go back to some of to the beginning of the conversation, right? That this is, why I think it's important to recognize that the study of prayer is and health is kind of a field in progress too, right? Like we had the STEP study that had some shortcomings, but that it was very transparent about and established the field later on. And then moving forward, I would assess the field as mixed positive, right? So I think for me, then I go back to, I think that tries to do something with it. It takes a sample, right? And hopefully the sample in some way represents the whole of the population. And then it is trying to do that, right? Does it do it? Well, that's the $1 million question. But it does say okay, here are the events and the cases of the illness, and we're going to maybe make it the same illness as well. And we're going to test, are the cases that get better within the context of prayer, the religious context, greater than chance, right? Now, none of them are saying, I want to be straightforward, right, that we captured the healing power of God in a box and I'm going to show it to you here, right? So that's why where my mind has always been has been mechanisms, right? Because I do think there is reasonably sufficient evidence to establish that these things are happening at a greater level in chance in the general population. But the question is why, right? Is it placebo? Is it completely psychosomatic? Is it related to adrenaline? These are things where I feel like my specialty stops. So I can place, I think there's a chance that the Lourdes case that you brought up is still a coincidence. I think there's a chance of that. I would say I'm 60-40 leaning on miracle, and I've got some prior biases here for sure that I'm more than welcome to admit, but I can place it in the data, right? And I can place it in the literature in a way that kind of makes sense to me. And so that's why I was going to what's the mechanism, right? Can I get this psychosomatically? Can I get this via adrenaline in the energy, right? I mean, people popping out of wheelchairs with collective effervescence makes perfect sense to me naturally. Right. And so it's okay, where does this fit into the literature then? If now I know it's been called into question, but the South Korean IVF study that we talked about, man, I just can't find a natural explanation where people who don't know they're being prayed for are going to have implantation at higher rates because of psychosomosis or adrenaline. On the other hand, it's not the perfect study, right? Somebody took their name off of it even. But I guess to the extent that I try to put on my researcher's brain and be as detached as I can, which is not completely, I don't believe we can be perfectly value-free. I'm not Weber. But I guess I look at the field in a way that says, I'm cautiously optimistic. I think there's a there. Doesn't mean we can't be overturned next week with a groundbreaking research agenda. Although I would be skeptical. Usually, the way studies come out, it's not, this is the study on prayer. It proves it very much accumulates, right? So be very skeptical if you see something like that in the news. But I guess I could say then it doesn't mean that over the next 10 years, it's not going to go in the opposite direction. But I think it's a fruitful area of inquiry, which may be more modest than some people are comfortable with. But I don't ask for much.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, Kenneth. I forgot what I was going to say, but I think that's also why, we're not just having one criteria. I think it's accumulation of criteria. So I think you are right that placebos, people can feel better, get out temporarily, but that's why it's also important in his case, he stayed cured for years on end. It wasn't like a temporary, I got up and then I get sick again. That's relevant. If his MS had come back 2 years later, let's say, that would be a lot worse for the miracle hypothesis, because it's that would be a lot more inclined with a natural up and down of neurological disease. So that, I think that's why you have to take these cumulatively and look at them case by case. But I like what you said with 60-40. It's do we each want to go around and kind of put a number on, and we can do this in the future when we talk about individual cases, the percentage you feel confident. I would probably say for me, It's probably like almost 50-50. Like I think I'm just as persuaded. Actually, I would actually probably take. I actually am probably a little bit more skeptical. I would probably say it's 50. Is that the number 55-45? Is that how the math works? Yeah, against, just because for me the biggest thing is the fact that we know it can go into remission. I don't think it can go into remission that late of a stage, and that it seemed to me to be a little gradual. And the fact that the neurologist was skeptical. Those for me tip me a little bit over to the maybe not, but there are things about it that I can't just say, oh yeah, almost certainly not. Like there are things that is impressive to me that are still unusual. So I would probably say 55 against, but that's still very much in the middle. So would you want to put a number on it, Gabriel?
Just I'll throw out a value. I'm not sure how good my assessment will be. I'll throw out a value. Sure, why not? So I think what's informing my value is that at least at the moment, and again, I think we're having conversations, so I'm totally fine changing my mind on these things. I feel like I put similar values on unknown natural mechanism as I do on miraculous explanation. And that's why I think some of our talk about theological explanation is relevant. And again, we have to focus on specifics at the time, so that's totally fine. That being said, I think that we've talked about how if you saw enough things happening in a religious context, that would be significant. So the fact that it did happen in a religious context is a chip in the direction of the miraculous explanation. This isn't something that happened randomly to someone who's religiously affiliated at home. I think I'm going to go a little bit based off of Caleb because I do not know what the normal remission or the ups and downs are. So that's something I do not know about. And the mention of the neurological expert saying,
I'll send you that paper, by the way. It's a lecture. He mentions that he doesn't go into detail. He just mentions.
So I will caveat saying that my assessment is assuming those things. So it would probably change if I knew the information was different. So putting those together. Again, I think it's just that, and this is what's weird for me is I think even though I put, I kind of think of unknown natural mechanism and miraculous explanation is similar. I just tend to think that generally speaking, I tend to lean more towards favoring an unknown natural mechanism due to like the history of science and stuff like this here. I'm questioning the intuition. I don't know how strong that is, but in such a case, then I would probably lean a little bit more like, off of me not having run all the numbers, maybe something like 95.5, probably against. But that I would be very open to changing my mind on it. So it's okay. So I think it's interesting there, and I don't know how strong. Yeah, go ahead, Caleb. Actually, you probably had something you was interesting.
No, you're good. I was just going to read. I brought it up real fast. I was just going to read the paragraph where he mentions it. If you're curious. This is Peter May. He's a general practitioner. He's written a little bit. He's a Christian, but he's typically pretty skeptical of this. So this is him talking about this. Hold on. In February 1999, a further Lourdes miracle number 66 was claimed. I've requested a copy of the medical findings for the International Committee, but they are not yet available in English. Is this Monsieur Jean-Pierre Bailly? Is believed to have been suffered from multiple sclerosis. However, when the committee reached its verdict, it was not unambiguous. Significantly, I understand it was the neurologist who dissented, claiming that the diagnosis of MS had never been safely secured. It was a speculative diagnosis, which can only lead to a speculative miracle. So, according to him,
even the diagnosis was speculative.
The neurologist wasn't sure that it was, in fact, multiple sclerosis, is what I'm understanding as far as that was his criticism. He was thinking maybe it was a misdiagnosis.
That would be kind of one of those explanations that skeptics would generally appeal to.
Yeah, I think so too.
The idea of a misdiagnosis then. So it's weird because there's so many different natural mechanisms that like a skeptic would, because you're appealing to unknown. You don't know what it is, but it could be this, it could be that, it could be that kind of a thing. So yeah, that's interesting. I don't know.
Yeah, so that was just me being, I'm trying to be as objective as I can, so I was me throwing that out there against it. But do you want me to go ahead and do the one I was going to do, or?
Sure. Well, first of all, how are people doing time wise? Are people doing okay right
now? Yeah, I might wrap up at the turn of the hour. So just
I try to. That's my goal is trying not to really go over 2 hours. Are you doing okay, Kenneth?
Yeah, I'm good. Thanks.
Sure. Go ahead.
I'm having fun though. Great. Can I? Is it going to let me share actually my screen?
Yeah, we didn't test that. Let me see.
Let me try screen sharing real fast. Let me know if you can see it.
It might be something I have to approve. I'm not sure.
Hold on. Okay, share screen.
I can do a different screen layout. Hold on.
Okay, hold on, wait a minute. I'm sharing. Can you see that?
Yes.
You got a black.
Add to the
You can see it.
stream. Okay.
Oh, perfect.
Here we go.
You can see that?
Yep.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So I did this one on one that's it's related to healing, but it's not explicitly healing. So this is one that I found interesting, and I preface this by saying I am a Protestant, and so I do have issues with this. So basically, my priors, I will say that I am biased against, because I talk about this in the book of, in 1950, the Pope declared that it was Marian dogma that one must affirm that the Virgin Mary was not only sinless, but was assumed into heaven, that she did not rot on this earth, and that anyone who does not affirm this will suffer the wrath of St. Paul and St. Peter on Judgment Day. And so as someone who does not affirm this, if there was evidence that this doctrine was true, it would cause some cognitive dissonance in me, I must admit. So I'm going to preface it by saying that. But the phenomenon I'm about to talk about is a series of Marian apparitions in Egypt that are, to me, really interesting. And I will also preface by saying that the religious context here is significant, because in the New Testament, specifically the Gospel of Matthew, it says that Jesus and Mary and Joseph were fleeing Herod, and so they traveled to Egypt for several years and lived there, and Jesus is raised there until they go back into Jerusalem and Nazareth. And so the Coptic Christians there, the Egyptian Christians, have certain churches that are like, that they believe are the sites to where, traditionally that the Virgin Mary passed through with Jesus and they stay the night or something. Now, historically, it's very hard to verify any of that, but that's just that's the religious background to establish that. So why Egypt is significant. So there's a series of different, this is the most well-known. I'm going to talk about four. There's a series of them, though. So Our Lady of Zaytun is the most well-known. So Zaytun is a traditional spot where Coptic Christians believe Jesus and his family fled to Egypt to escape King Herod. On April 2nd, 1968, there was a luminous figure that was seen on top of a Coptic church dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Originally, there was a Muslim man who thought that it was a woman about to commit suicide and jump off the church. But as a crowd gathered, some people suggested that this could be the Virgin Mary, and that was the predominant view. This was Muslims and Christians as well. These light appearances continued to occur intermediately at night up until 1971. So starting in 68 and 71, these always happened at night, and these were always on top of the roof of the church. Tens of thousands of pilgrims saw this over the years. There was an investigation by the Egyptian government originally to see if this was a hoax. They shut down at one point all the power in the city, but the light was still there. They could not, after investigation, find any projection device or generator within a 15-mile radius of the city. So they really were not sure what was causing this light, and they had no explanation. There were journalists, skeptics who traveled to Zaytun to investigate, and they were convinced that this was a sense of kind of mass hysteria, but they did say that they did see a light. So she said, I saw a light. It didn't look like a person to me. I don't know what it was, but she thought that religious predisposition was a big factor as to why they thought this was the Virgin Mary. And many people also reported healings. I'll talk about one of these in a minute at the site of Zaytun when these were happening. So the newspaper did take lots of photographs of these. So these is kind of what they look like. You'll see more touched up ones that have it more clear, but I think the one on the right is the most clear one as far as her. It looks like Mary has a halo on her head and is praying on top of a church. At first, it was like this kind of disembodied light, and it became more human as it went on and did it. So you can see pictures here of the light. These were taken in the 60s. And there were also, along with this figure, there were also like dove-like figures seen hovering around her. There were also luminous. Sometimes they would fly in the shape of a cross, like the bottom picture around this time. Now, there were also another series of them. These are the Marian apparitions of Shubra in 1986. Now, I don't think that, to my knowledge, there's not a picture of like an actual like figurative apparition, but there is like pictures of these lights in the background. This also occurred on top of a Coptic church. Intermediately, these always happened on top of the church at night. And there were healings reported. The most notable one was from a newspaper called the Watani Weekly Newspaper that reported that there was a young girl named Teresa Solomon Youssef. She had blindness because she had an accident where a needle went into her cornea and damaged the nerves there and severed it. She, after going to this church and seeing this light, instantly became to see, and they did get a medical doctor. The newspaper reports that a medical doctor looked over it and affirmed that her visual acuity was now completely normal, inexplicably. So that was in 1986 to 1991. In 2000, there was another series of Marian apparitions, this time on top of a church in Aswit, I think is how you pronounce that. And these happened only for a few months this time, not for a few years, from August 2000 to January 2001. You can see that it kind of looks humanoid on the left and a really, really bright image on top of church in the middle. And on the right, you can see in that little circular thing that these are like the dove-like creatures that we see hovering above there. So these also, again, these were investigated. No light source could be found. These occurred on top of Coptic churches at night. The last one, that most recent one, was in 2009, which is Warak. And this was taken on cell phones, so they're in color. This only happened for one night, so it was only between 1 to 4 a.m. So unlike the other ones, this was not an intermediate thing that happened over the course of several months. And this was reported. And I think in this one as well, there was no obvious light source found on top of this church as to what was causing this. And so reflecting off of all of that, I kind of had mixed feelings. So I'll go over my doubts at first. So I think the first explanation to me seems like pareidolia, as far as people see images, in objects. So people can see things in the clouds, people can see things in the trees. And the fact that in Zaytun, this was originally seen as a woman and like a light, and someone said, hey, maybe this is the Virgin Mary because this is on top of the Church of the Virgin Mary. That could institute a sense of mass hysteria and groupthink and religious predisposition, right? Another question is, if this was the Virgin Mary, why did she never speak? Why didn't she ever say anything? There was no message, even though, it was theologically significant with the location. Why did she never say anything? She just appeared and moved around a little bit. The only real explanation that I've seen attempted as far as the actual reason for the light was an article published in a geology journal back, I think, in the 80s about earthquake lights. And earthquake lights are a very speculative, hypothetical proposition, because sometimes when there are earthquakes, there are lights seen in the sky, and there's debate as to whether these are actually caused by the earthquakes or because the earthquakes like destroy generators and that's what does it, because there's no known mechanism to actually say why they are connected. But the paper argues that there were earthquakes around Zaytun at the time and that these could have caused it. But there have been criticisms of that paper published because the lights of that kind are not consistent with earthquake lights, because earthquake lights will appear in many places at any time of day, and the Zaytun lights only appeared on top of a church at night. And to their knowledge, there's no evidence that lights of that kind happen. Another question is, are these similar to UFO cases? We do know there are cases of weird objects in the sky, weird lights that appear. And so are these maybe the same kinds of unknown aerial phenomenon that happen? And, another one I just added on is, why did no one climb on top of the roof of the church and try to see if how close they could get? Now, maybe if they thought this was the Virgin Mary, they would be disrespectful. They wouldn't want to attempt something bad happening. I don't know, but that is an interesting question. But Steph, but I don't think it's all on the skeptic's adage here. I think that the apologist can come back and say that there are things that I genuinely can't explain. So first of all, the source of the light, and this is admitted by everyone, is unknown. We have never been able to identify it for sure, and it's still mysterious to this day. And the only attempts that have been made have been pretty criticized for not being very adequate and explanatory. This was seen by a variety of people, thousands of people, including Christians, Muslims, and atheists, a very wide group of people. So it's not just Christians reporting this. There were sudden healings, like the one I mentioned, that apparently some of them were medically verified. Some of them could just be psychosomatic, but some of these are medically explicable that happened with these healings. Another one is, why do these lights only appear in Egypt on top of churches at night? Why do we not have examples of these happening routinely? We do have examples of UFOs and stuff, but these typically don't repeat themselves in a single location. These are typically unpredictable. I'm not aware of any case of a light of an unknown region. Of an unknown source constantly appearing on top of the same building or same location only at night. In this kind of way. And why is this only happening in Egypt in this sense? Theologically, it can be explained, well, because Egypt is important to the Virgin Mary, and that's why these are on top of Coptic churches, because it's religious context. So I would also ask this, why is it that we don't have any really good parallels to this? And why is this only happening in these contexts? And what about those luminous doves? Why is the light sometimes humanoid, and why is it sometimes separated as far as what does that make? These aren't regular doves, because regular doves don't fly at night, nor do they glow in the dark. So what really is this? Is this a hoax? Is this some kind of weird natural phenomenon? So that kind of just ends the my presentation there. But so I don't know if anyone had any thoughts on those or thought that was a fairly fair assessment. But I just to say, as a Protestant, I really don't know what to think of this, and I think it's super fascinating regardless.
Yeah, I mean, really difficult to assess, right? Especially not being early. I've heard of it, but I haven't done any meaningful investigation into it. So my primary thoughts were first theological, and I guess to something I was thinking about earlier, not really having an over-under on the accuracy of the narrative, but I don't have immediate problems with it, as a Protestant, because especially when you get into the dove imagery, actually before you were saying that, the first thing I thought was this would fit into certain ways people in charismatic circles interpret the Holy Spirit, right? They'll also talk about lights, glowing phenomena, that sort of a thing. And until I saw the one on the right, which I thought that must have been faked because it looks so much like a painting of like the Virgin Mary, like at least the shape. So I'm curious. I don't know. I'm not accusing anything, right? But it was a little on the nose for that regard. And then I went back from like, okay, well, like if I were to accept this, and I'm not sure that I do, I went from it doesn't have to be Coptic, and then it is Coptic, but then you got into the dove and the cross. And when I saw the cross, I thought of UFO imageries. It wasn't the shape, but like that's how a lot of those photos present. And so, like, if I were to take this at face value and say, oh, there's something there, then I could, I think, pretty easily harmonize it in this is just Christian imagery, right? You've got a cross here, you've got the dove here, which has been the symbol of the Holy Spirit. You may have a Marian apparition here as well, which in the broader, Egyptian context, right? Like the Coptic Church, I mean, there are some others, but, the Coptic Church is about 10% of the population, and that is the default representation of Christianity, right? So if you're a Protestant who doesn't share some of the theological distinctives, but you have any sort of an accommodationist theology where God respects people's cultures and manifests in a familiar way, at least theologically, I have no problem with it. In fact, there are other signs there that say it is a broader Christian manifestation. In terms of the accuracy, I'm not opposed to it, but I'm not blown away either.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, thank you, Caleb. Appreciate the presentation of the case there. So first of all, I don't know if you get the reference or not. When you went to the part on the cross there, the first thing that came to my mind is it's laminin, man. It's laminin. Does anyone know that reference?
I don't get the reference.
Oh, no. Okay, gotcha. Are you familiar with Louis Giglio? He's some of the Passion conferences he'll present.
I think I've heard the name, but
it's a structure that it's in DNA and it vaguely looks like a cross.
Oh wait, no, I do. Okay, yeah, okay. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, and he did a presentation on that, and how there's a constellation looking to a star. It looks like the cross. Yeah. And so, but that being so, that part didn't particularly impress me, but it doesn't mean other parts weren't very interesting. So, I thought. So if I'm putting on my skeptical lens, the first thought that comes to my mind, I think that the number one most probable naturalistic explanation would probably be hoax. I think I would go to that. Not that another kind of natural explanation isn't possible. Like, again, some sort of weird natural phenomenon, something's going weird, wonky with the grid and hydration. I don't know the science behind that. I don't even know if that's possible or not. So maybe something, but wouldn't be my go-to. And so I think this gets to the question of reports, maybe, because so I think the thing that was interesting to me is like no known light source could be responsible for this, right? And so my question is like delving in on that. What does that mean? Does this mean that we cannot produce this effect, or we didn't find anything around there that could have produced this effect, right?
I believe it'd probably be the latter one, but I don't. Yeah, I believe they were searching for like a generator or some kind of projector.
Now, the question is how easy would be the hoax to pull off. So, like, are we talking about David Copperfield level preparation here? Are we talking about a few kids who have a cool projector and done some light shows, some concerts are able to do this? Or, it's weird because it's not like religious hoax don't exist. So I think when you try to psychoanalyze, well, why would somebody do this? It's like, it's kind of weird to think that someone would care enough to do it as a prank. Not that it's completely unreasonable, but it does seem that some devout people will sometimes do these sort of things for some sort of weird reasoning in their head. And it's hard to explain, but that does exist. And so those are kind of the thoughts that came to mind to me. And what's weird for me too is, and what's kind of difficult in assessing some of these things, it's like you don't want to be so unreasonably skeptical, but the same things that would result in like the religious context being significant, where this would be interpreted as the Virgin Mary, is also the same things that would kind of prime someone to sort of see and interpret this stuff as the Virgin Mary.
Right.
I think your point on frequency is well taken. So the idea that you showed multiple different sites where this is happening.
Why is it only in Egypt and why is it only on top of churches in this kind of way?
Right. There's 3 cases. I don't remember the names of each place.
There are four, but I didn't have the fourth. The second one didn't have like pictures. I mean, there was like a light in the background, but that's to my knowledge the only pictures. Most of the other ones had pictures.
Right. Yeah. So how would I rank some of the criteria? So I think I think sourcing is still probably pretty good there. I mean, you have great pictures of this stuff here going on, so I think it's hard to
at least we have pictures. I mean, that's
Yeah.
usually not a given. I mean, that's like at least we have pictures.
Yeah, right.
It's usually not a given.
Yeah, so that's probably a good thing there. It's not like someone
It's not a hallucination, at least. Like when there's something,
Right.
something
Make up in the
objective.
story 1700s, and that we came across
Yeah.
it 50 years later.
Having no background here whatsoever, I would just want to know how those photos compare to the average quality of photos taken in Egypt in the 1970s. Did you say it was?
Late 60s, early 70s at night. I mean,
Okay, yeah, probably not great, but just it came to my mind.
Yeah. So I mean, that's fair. And to be fair, when you look up, those are the original, to my knowledge, the original images published in newspapers. If you Google image it, there will be some ones that are a lot more like defined, but they are touched up. So people have touched up to do it. So, but the ones I showed you, were not the ones that were touched up. So you'll see ones where it's like clear as day, outlined as her, but like that's them. If you can see the originals and compare and see the shape is the exact same way they outlined it to make it more clear. But I think the one on the right is to my knowledge is what it originally looked like. But you're right but I wonder, it's like, if you didn't know, if I just showed you a picture and didn't explain to you what it was, would you think it was the Virgin Mary? Is it knowing that?
Just the one on the right. At least the one on the right I would have. I don't know about the others.
Okay.
Yeah, some of them, maybe this is a deficit in artistic sensibilities. So they definitely seemed a little more nebulous to me. But again, that's...
Right. But we also don't know what the Virgin Mary looked like. That's also the traditional depiction, but you have no idea what she actually looked like.
Especially the shape of the head, the way that's reflected in art. I thought the one on the right, my default was to fake because it seemed like too on the nose.
And it looked like she was almost praying too. Like it kind of was like
I thought I was seeing like a negative of an icon or something. Yeah.
Yeah.
But the other two, it would have seemed figure-ish. I would not have gone to Marian apparition over them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I that's the point of it. I agree. I agree that the context, because when they originally saw it, it was a Muslim who thought it was a woman who was going to jump off. And and then they were like, "Oh, is that a light?" And then they were like, "Oh, wait, that's Virgin Mary's church. Maybe that's the Virgin Mary." And that's when you get. So I do think that there's some pareidolia going on, and the journalists who went there were skeptics. They said that to let them, it just looked like a blob of light, but they didn't deny there was a light. They just it doesn't look like a person to me. It just looks like a blob of light. Yeah. So there is probably a lot of religious hysteria going on there, so I'm conceding that. But I also think that the points I made at the end are fair. I don't think that the explanations for the light are good, and most skeptics will say that we don't really know what caused it. I think the frequency is weird to me, as far as I don't know of any parallel examples that, like, I know of UFO examples, but UFOs typically don't repeat in the same way, where they can happen in the exact same spot only at night in that context. So that's also weird to me. And so for those reasons I have to, and of course, like some of the healings and stuff, I don't think those healings are that well documented other than like the newspaper reportage. So it depends on how well you take those. But I admit that I don't have a good explanation. And so if we're going to put numbers on it, for me, I would say, oh gosh, I probably would say 70 to 75% in favor of miracle to me, just because to me, it's really weird just because we have so many witnesses, variety of witnesses, pictures. I think it's it checks off a lot of the boxes that we would want. Maybe not all of them, but I think it's better attested than a lot of ones we had, just because we have so many different, and it happens on multiple occasions. I think to me that makes it a little bit more credible than some of the other ones.
Can I ask something on this, Caleb? What do you think would be the best natural explanation for this one if you were going to have to postulate one?
I don't think the Hooks one's actually really good to be, because I
that's why I was curious.
I would have to say some kind of weird light that, whether it's electromagnetism in the sky, whatever causes UFOs, I would say some kind of weird natural light thing that we just don't know. But I don't think
the locations would just be coincidence on that view. Then
but that's what's hard about it.
I think Hoax would. Well, so obviously, and the thing that's tough about this is you could speculate that there's more than one of those going on, and that they're both improbable, but they happen to different. So, but because of the frequency where they happened, I think Hoax makes more sense, given the religious significance of the sites where the natural phenomena.
It's a bit, I mean, this doesn't completely rule it out, but that's a dangerous move. As a religious minority in late 60s, early 70s.
It is.
Now, I don't want to impute, the post-revolutionary environment onto that. It is very different in, that's Sadat and Hussein. I think it's overlapping in those two administrations, not Islamist administrations by most accounts, right? I don't want to overstate that, but, you're still a religious minority group. And that has experienced, off and on persecution waves. Doesn't mean it couldn't happen, right? You could have religious fervor that is strong enough to make you be willing to risk your life to convert people. On the other hand, if you're doing a hoax, then you know that it doesn't necessarily follow that you believe your religion's fake, but
that's fake at least.
You know that's fake at least.
Fake, yeah.
Doesn't make it impossible, right? I'm only talking about probabilities here. That I have I think I'm more aligned with if I have to go to a natural explanation, it's a phenomenon, right? Like I think the Muslim guy probably saw something. If I'm going natural,
I think we all agree they saw something. I mean, I think we all agree there was something that, like, no one's just saying this never happened. Like, I think we're all agree. Yeah, something happened. Yeah.
The moon glowing behind clouds.
Very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And then people start to run with it. Oh, I saw it too. You know, the donkey lady in San Antonio and stuff like that, right? Like, that's my naturalistic explanation too.
How plausible do you think that how plausible do you personally think that is?
Gosh, I don't know. I'm almost agnostic on this.
So you want to say maybe 50-50?
I'll still give a number. I think it helps. It helps, I think, refine intuitions when you go back. Because one thing that's cool is I'll go back, I'll rewatch the videos and be like, what do I think? Do I agree with everything I said? What do I think? No, because it's good. I think this should be an iterative process, right? Where you're constantly checking, thinking, and more perspectives are better.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe you guys don't find this as significant. I think that intuition that I'm moving more towards hoax is the better natural explanation. I think that might be a little significant here, and that might relate to intuitions on what we think about humans and human behavior. And I think that might be very important.
Can I ask though, do you think if it was a hoax, would this have to be a series of hoaxers like over, because this is like from 60s to 2009. So I don't think this would be like, would people be repeating this?
No, that wouldn't make sense.
So you'd have to posit that there'd be multiple hoaxers repeating this, like assuming they have knowledge of how to replicate this.
Let me maybe nuance the idea of hoax, right? So again, I come from a charismatic background, right? And I think we maybe touched on this in the after talk a little bit. So there's this interesting thing about people so whether or not you have a favorable view or non-favorable view of charismatic communities overall, I think most reasonable people would say that there's some really bad actors out there.
Sure.
Yeah. I'll give you the one that I went to school for. So I went to school for ministry at a place called Valor Christian College. It's associated with, have you guys ever heard of the person Rod Parsley?
Mm-hmm.
If you have, you probably heard of him. He at one point tried to get big and being one of the religious influences in John McCain's campain back in 2008. Once he kind of found out some unscrupulous things, he kind of tried to drop him as fast as possible. His daughter at one service we were at there mentioned the idea that if the one thing that might be in the way of you and your one of your relatives not becoming saved might be that you haven't offered the seed faith that God has been telling you to do. So that offering, that was interesting. That made me incredibly angry. You have no idea. So now the question for me is this: all right, so how are you going to psychoanalyze people coming from this perspective, right? So I think there's someone maybe coming from a Penn Jillette or maybe a Christopher Hitchens type.
James Randi.
These are just outright frauds. They're just psychopaths. They don't give, they don't care whatsoever about this. And I don't think so. Given my experience of this, that's not. So I think there's just weird thinking, rationalization process going on. And they don't make sense to us because they don't make sense to us, but they make sense to them. There's all sorts of weird human behavior. I think as a general rule, I tend to not underestimate the human capacity for weird reasoning, jumping to conclusions and stuff like that. So can I think of someone being a devout believer? Can I conceive of somebody being a devout believer who somehow has rationalized that this is for God's glory? Maybe God's that doing this here some way. And it's like, it's okay. It's like, it's a necessary evil or something like that. I could conceive of that kind of stuff, or even think about maybe more on the, more in a direction where it's like, God's going to work through this mechanism. So it's not really this. God's like imbuing this with some sort of spiritual, to us, these seem like absolutely preposterous explanations. But do I think people can come up with these explanations? Absolutely. And so
I think it's possible for sure.
Do you think it's like lying to like the Nazi? Like lying is wrong, and even though you're lying to the Nazis, you still are sincere in your belief to protect the Jews, but you're willing to lie because it's an you have an underlying belief of what that lying is going to help benefit this belief that you really do believe.
Yeah, the salvation of souls, the greater good, that sort of a thing.
Yeah. So if I have to lie to get people saying I really do believe it's going to save people,
even
that might be.
I believe this can happen in religious communities where even the religious leader would absolutely condemn that kind of reasoning, but still within the congregation. How many different religious communities where you've seen people who are like well read or something and they have great theology? People have been attending these services for years, and all of a sudden they'll just say something, and you hear it, and you're like, "Wait, you believe what? Have you been listening to messages for the past 2 years?" Right. And so I think, go ahead.
That's very precedented. Yeah, there are often disconnects between populations and their clergy. There are some in other areas, right? I know a very good example. We have great data for that.
Yeah. To me, I'm not even against the idea of they wouldn't have any motivation. I'm not going to defend that. I agree with you that there could be motivation, but my issue is more the pragmatic aspect of it. Is I don't know how, given the investigation, the fact that this wasn't just one time, they did this multiple times over years and then waited the decades, and maybe these are independent. It's like how they be able to elude it every single time. I feel like that's just either they're the cleverest hoaxers on earth, able to get to evade police and do this in a way, and they shut off all the power. Like they're inventing technology. I just feel like it seems very elaborate to have to posit that they would continue to do this multiple times, like, and not get caught. And so I just can't think of how it would be executed in
each case in the areas that
I don't know. I believe it was with
because that would be
recent one, the Zaytun one. It was the Waraq one. It was the last one. It was for the night. I don't know about the other two. I don't remember how much investigation. I know mostly about the Zaytun investigation. I don't know about the other.
I'll throw this out quickly as the other hoax explanations. I didn't bring it up there, but there could also be this idea of someone doing something they thought was religiously significant. They didn't think it would be interpreted as supernatural, and you're going to shut the hell up because you do not want to get in trouble. Because
that's good. That's a good.
So that might be.
They would probably get arrested for that. Yeah.
Salem witch explanation, right? Some person comes up with an explanation to get out of trouble, and then all of a sudden we believe there's a witch in the town. It's like
we wanted to. I wanted to put on a beautiful show to honor,
Virgin
Mary or something, right? And people thought it was real, and now I'm going to get caught, or I'm going to be afraid, or I'm going to hurt their piety or something, right? Yeah, it's plausible for sure.
Yeah, and it's hard to figure out, like, how do I put a number on this? Like, because here's the thing. I feel like, so maybe you'll agree with this. I feel like for the skeptics, in most of these cases, right, if you're going to, because you have a bunch of these case studies we could bring up, right? From different scenarios, right? And if we're going to go like 95.5 in each of them, I think at some point you have to be like, okay, a miracle happened at some point. You know what I mean? Just based off of the numbers, right? So I feel like your value would have to be something at least like 99.1 or something like that. Or maybe like in some cases, but I don't know of a principled criteria where you go like 99.9991 and then it's like, okay, 70-30 in 2 cases or something like that. It's like, I don't know. So my inclination is low, like 99.1, but I don't know how accurate this is. Like I don't know how.
So you feel much more. You think that the Lord's healing is more impressive than this one? I guess that's just interesting. Like,
I know I do.
Okay, that's fine. I guess my intuition.
I don't know how consistent those are with each other. I'll have to think about that when I go.
Yeah, I don't know
for sure. Because I think the thing for me is. So maybe this is another part that's maybe influencing my intuitions is that I think maybe you mentioned about earlier, right? How much, I'm sorry, there's some background noise there, guys. How much you felt like the skeptic needs to come up with explanations for the historical background and knowledge we know about the resurrection claim, right? And if you felt, and I felt like, a skeptic should, if you're in this space, you know enough information where I do feel like you should have some idea. But I didn't say like how fine-grained that explanation has to be, right? So it could be kind of a broad appeals as long as it's not ridiculously broad, like something natural, something that, Right. But I think in this case here, like even if you were going to tally the 2 different natural explanations, something that was a hoax versus something that was some weird natural phenomenon with the grid or something in the sky, some electrical property we don't know about. If you put those 2 together, and then you were going to say, so basically your explanation would be, some sort of weird light phenomena or light interacted, but you can't make a precise explanation of the mechanism of how that happens.
Because you don't know why, you can't explain why it was why the light. Because just saying it's like with it's same with what you were talking about with the like what I was going to say when you talk about the outliers, but as far as, statistically, you're always going to have it in a range at bottom. I was like, that's true, but I think you still have to explain the outlier. So I don't like when
So
people
it's
just
going
say,
to be a vague explanation. I feel to the degree to
Exactly.
which you feel like you can be comfortable and okay with the vagueness of the explanation is going to really influence your intuitions on these cases. I feel.
Right, but that's when people say like the word spontaneous remission, people act as if that's an explanation, which spontaneous remission just means it went away.
It went away.
That's literally just what it means.
Or misdiagnosis. Like I feel like
true.
are much less likely to rule that out than maybe believers are, and there's probably biases at play in that.
Yeah,
as
it
well.
would depend on the
case.
It obviously depends. Yeah, it depends on the case, how many doctors you have. If it's one doctor, if it was versus like 10 doctors, so all of that is relevant for sure. But that's why I just think that it's. I don't like just when we say unknown things. I think you're right. We have to be pretty specific, because if I just said this was an outlier, that doesn't explain. Okay, but why wasn't it? Like, why was it faster in this case, or why was it the fact that this person has spontaneous remission? Like, is there what natural mechanism could we hypothesize? And sometimes you can do that, and sometimes you can't. And so, I think that's.
I don't think we want to get into explanatory virtues too late into this discussion here, but I think that's where we're coming to Matt, right? So the degree to which you have a detailed explanation, how much does that weigh as far as you favoring one explanation as superior to another explanation? I think
we can do that next show, by the way, if you want. We can have that be the focus since we're wrapping up here. If we want to continue that on next show.
Oh yeah, I think it's good to bob back and forth, because you can see how your intuitions change on different different virtues based off of cases you've considered and the conversation that naturally flowed from that. Because I don't know about you, I think it's kind of cool about these conversations is I can't predict the directions things are going to go in. So like I couldn't have told you this is the way the conversation would have ended up when it started, and I couldn't have told you that last time too. So, but I feel like I've been talking too much. Kenneth, what have you thought about what's my skeptical mind on this so far?
Yeah, I mean, I have no personal assessments of other people's minds. I enjoy this process as something we're recognizing as a kind of fluid process, right? Like I'm one who's just taking in this miracle case for basically the first time, right? I know the broad history of it, but I'm learning a lot of it, right? And so, yeah, I guess the only thing that came to mind was like, I think then the burden on somebody to put forth an alternative explanation, just intuitively, I guess to me depends on what they're saying about mine, right? Or about, let's presume I'm somebody who I am an Egyptian Coptic Christian, and I am certain that happened, right? Like if somebody tells me, my gosh, yeah, this is kind of new information for me, I'm really skeptical toward miraculous experiences, and I favor a naturalistic one. I guess if I were really in the mood to proselytize, I can ask why. Why are you against that? And is that really fully consistent? But I just think on a person-to-person level, it makes sense to me. It's now, if you were to tell me no, that's irrational. You shouldn't believe that, right? It's wrong to believe that you had a miraculous experience there, and I really don't trust your judgment for thinking this guy was healed at Lourdes and that the Holy Spirit or Mary appeared to you at church. Then I would say, yeah, like what have you got that's better that you have actually made a positive declaration that not only am I wrong, but that it's bad, that it's irrational. But I don't hear anything like that coming from anybody, right? So I think it's just an honest, sorting through the data, which makes this so much better than social media.
Can I ask one more thing before we wrap this up? Because I'm curious. I'm getting this. So I don't know how many of you know of Dale Allison's work on. He's a New Testament scholar, and he's a Protestant Christian, but he's pretty moderate liberal. He's not like super fundamentalist. And in his book on the resurrection, he has a section of chapters on parallels, modern parallels, and he has a whole chapter on Zaytun in the first case. And he basically plays this to say, like, I don't know what happened. I personally don't think this was Mary because I'm biased, but I also admit I don't have a good explanation for this. And he says, but how do we compare this to historical claims like this? So if we take the claim of Jesus appearing to 500 or to groups of people, how much similarity could we see, or could it have been something like, as far as we know, a group of people seeing some weird light in the sky and interpreting that given predisposition to Jesus? And are we more confident in, if we reject this one or don't think it's likely, does that make us less confident with the resurrection appearances? Because do we objectively have better, we have photos of these, we have living witnesses, do we objectively have better evidence for these than we do for the ones that happened 2,000 years ago? And if we're going to be skeptical of these, should we be even more skeptical of that one, or are they not in the same? So he asks all those. And so I guess Kenneth is a Christian and Gabriel is not, but like, how do each of you interpret that? Do you think that's a good observation, or do you think that there's not an analogy there?
Yeah, I mean, for me, context is king, and one, again, just being fully transparent, that I know far more about the case for the resurrection than I do the case for the Marian apparitions. But yeah, I just, ancient history approached from multiple angles and things that we talk about in terms of oral transmission and written transmission and who was there and what did the supposed primary source of the proposed miracle actually say to people and that sort of a thing. And what's the the psychology of religion that we're implementing here compared to a religious minority almost 2,000 years later in a relatively secular autocratic part of the world, autocratic government with a Muslim majority population and the Christian minority there. It's just really hard for me to align these up, at least on the surface of it. Doesn't mean I couldn't later, but it's hard for me to say, yeah, that shines a light on what I think about the resurrection. I suppose if I were really going hard against the Marian apparitions and said I can't trust any of that testimony, I probably could make application then. But especially since I'm not too sure about that, it's hard to make application.
Yeah, I have some thoughts. Well, first of all, Caleb, actually, I want to pick that up at some point later because I think it will be interesting to compare cases and then what we find, where we find parallels, where we find disanalogies.
If you want, I can do another one. He has another chapter that's supposed to be an analogy to the empty tomb in Buddhist tradition. If you want to go over that one, that one's also controversial. Lydia McGrew made 2 videos against Allison for that. She really hated the comparison, but I think it's fun to talk about.
Each case is enough, but different. But yeah, it's still, I still think it's worth going over for sure. So, what was my thought on it? So, the first thought I would say is I don't know if all apologists, and I don't know where I would stand on this, would agree that it's weird to say evidence or sourcing, however you want to phrase it there, that the overall information that we have for the resurrection claim is worse than that we'd have for this case that you brought up here. Am I calling correctly in Zeitun or?
Well, there's multiple. There's Zeitun's the biggest one, so we can just
these theories of Marian apparitions.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, and so that's the first thought that comes to mind, and that's going to be kind of like how much weight you place on different forms of evidence, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't know if I would agree with them on that.
Well, it depends on. I didn't interrupt you. Because I think it depends on what we like. If we're talking about just pure quantitative number of witnesses, I think we can demonstrate Zeitun is more witnesses. If we're talking about photographs, yeah, but there might be other things like disposition and stuff.
Right.
So it depends on what we're counting.
Right, and that's why I think it'd be good to put a pin in that and come back to it because we can get into some details about what we think the real relevant differences would be. And I don't feel like I could draw all those out at the moment. But as far as you mentioned the 500, so I think that's the point that I think you. So the thought that comes to my mind in the Christian favor would be that people maybe would be, at least with the Marian apparitions, might be more primed to see and interpret this as a Marian apparition than people might be to see this as Jesus. Maybe I'm wrong about that, or maybe yes, that's true, but it's not so far apart as to be so drastic and that kind of stuff. Yeah, I would argue that there's lots of different phenomenon that could be interpreted as an appearance of a divine figure that wouldn't just be something like the Marian apparition. So I don't think the skeptic has to be married to that as their explanation. I think that as far as parallels go concerning the 2 different visions and how they were interpreted, I think the other thing maybe you made this point about the Christian belief kind of being unique in that religious context, so not being kind of with what the status quo was. Mm-hmm. You can also question that as well, but sure, that is true that even if they saw something and they interpreted it as significant for this budding Christian movement, they might not have interpreted it as an appearance of Jesus, right? So that would be a chip in favor of that. And again, I think I'm seeing is that maybe I'm more comfortable with vagueness in this. As a psychology major, trying to pin down every causal mechanism that caused one human to act this way and one human to act another way is basically an impossible task. You can get closer. Well, I don't know if you can get closer and closer, but you can get some broad strokes. You can get some. You can develop some constructs about certain things and risk factors and stuff like that. But I just feel like, given the history and development of of religions and what we know about religious belief formation, it doesn't seem too crazy to see that people could interpret ambiguous phenomenon as being Jesus. I don't think it would have to be super probable. I just think it's definitely a plausible route, and maybe I would just leave it at that until I thought more about it.
Yeah, I think it's a good answer. But yeah, I just wanted to bring that up because I'm trying to play both sides here. So
no, it's good though. It's good.
It's funny. I think that's a fair point. I think there's a middle ground. Because I think, and Allison says this too. The skeptics will want to play up the parallels and try to say, oh, these are just like, and it's like, well, no, there are relevant differences. You know, there's probably more persecution in the Christian context. There's more difference of like predisposition as to what the culture expects, but there's also a greater number. We have living eyewitnesses. We have maybe more confidence in the details because we have people close to the fact. And so I think it's somewhere in the middle. And so the skeptic might be wrong to completely play them up, but the apologist who wants to downplay them and say, no, they're absolutely nothing alike, that might also be an exaggeration. It's like there are things we can find here that are similar with groups of people saying that they see things supernatural, right? So the answer is probably somewhere in the middle, I think.
And the other thing I might want to tease out more in future discussions would be this idea again of so anyone who's had to write an academic paper, right? It's like the discussion section and your results sections. It's like you can have the same results section and have a very different discussion section. And so when you see a lot of reports, there is this question still of like, what assessments are still kind of being embedded into these reports that in and of themselves aren't just objectively. So like even in newspapers have this problem, right? You find this something that happens in society, you're trying to report it objectively. And even in trying to reporting objectively, you report it slightly differently than somebody else because you kind of interpret it. In that act of reporting, you are involved in interpreting, and you just try to minimize how much interpreting you can possibly do. And so I think that's interesting. So when you have written reports, when you have witness reports and stuff like that, that's something that comes to mind, and that gets back to vagueness. Like how much can we put on that as far as assessing reliability of different sources for the case of the Marian apparitions versus the case of the resurrection. So,
yeah, I think that's good. Do we want to wrap it up now since we'll
wrap it up? Camp, do you want to say any last things there?
No, but thanks for inviting me to participate. It was really great.
Yeah, awesome. So yeah, we'll end there, guys. And thanks for anyone out there who might watch this later, who's watching now. And yeah, hopefully we'll continue a broader conversation about miracles and how we assess them and how that reflects our intuitions. All right. Cool. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.